Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Um, Not going to spend a lot of time on show business, meta business. I'll say that want to continue encouraging subscribers. We hit 5,000 subscribers and have kept on going. So if you like what we do, subscribing helps you keep up with it, and doing the little notification bell on YouTube. So please do that, and let's get right to it with Ryan Turnipseed from Oklahoma, also known as Ryan Rubsamen. Hi, Ryan.
Hello, how are you?
It's so the original German just sounds more. It has more meaning, you know.
Yeah, so most original things tend to do that.
Yeah, it just sounds right. Um, okay, so I already talked about subscribers, so let's get into it. This is Econ Minis. So in theory, we move fast and we get through several topics. Obviously, the big one that we're going to get to is the central banks. It'll be a little bit Fed focused, but really what we're talking about are central banks in general, not just the Fed. Anybody's central bank. Just I'd say about 99% of what we're going to say about central banks applies to all of them. Okay, so let's go to our first article. Let me make sure I'm on it. Yep, okay. Let's go to that. Okay, due to various things happening in my life, I'm a little late on this, but did want to talk about the Nobel Prize. Peter Klein, who I've met many times at the Mises Institute over the years, writes about the Nobel Prize or in economics. And it came as a bit of a shock for me. I'd been looking forward to talking about it because I thought David Card, who's one of the three recipients, would be on the naughty list from my point of view, for reasons we'll see in a moment. Instead, he got a Nobel Prize. Not just did he get a Nobel Prize, he got a Nobel Prize for the work that I thought of him as being infamous for. So
hmm
as we'll see, it's a little bit of a worrying sign with where the mainstream of economics is going. So first thing Peter mentions is that one of the first things he mentions is that David Card became famous for his 1994 paper with the late Alan Kruger on the minimum wage. And so what is so controversial about this paper? Well, they kind of threw out the theoretical supply and demand analysis, right? Which is all other things equal. If you increase the minimum wage, you're going to get increased unemployment. And instead, they went to an atheoretical empirical exercise. What was that? They looked at a change in fast food restaurant employment in New Jersey versus neighboring Pennsylvania. And New Jersey had increased its minimum wage, the state level minimum wage, and Pennsylvania hadn't. And they said, well, we don't really see employment going down in New Jersey. So it looks like economics has been wrong for hundreds of years, and supply and demand doesn't work and all that stuff. They were roundly criticized in my circles, but I guess the Nobel Committee didn't hear about that. So yeah, minimum wages do not price low productivity workers out of the labor market. We're not going to get into the critique of that study. Peter says the details of that study are widely disputed, to put it politely. But that
Yeah,
empirical approach has been championed. Go ahead, Rand.
yeah. With the empirical approach itself, it should just be nonsense from the outset to anyone. It would be the equivalent of taking another field that's kind of gone off the rails a little bit in the last century, mathematics, and saying we're going to throw out Pythagoras' theorem and all of that, and we're only going to operate off from empiricism, what we observe in the world. That's essentially what they've done here. They've thrown out one of
Yeah,
the basic laws, one of the basic axioms, and they've just said, all right, well, we're just going to go off of pure observations because we don't need the theorem. It's insane, to be quite honest.
right. So, what is this new approach? Unlike laboratory experiments in which subjects can be assigned randomly to treatment and control groups, with the experimenter holding all other conditions constant, observational studies require statistical tricks to satisfy the ceteris paribus conditions. Ceteris paribus is all else held equal. Basically, they're saying, okay, yeah, we know that in the real world we can't hold all else things equal, but we will use various statistical massaging to kind of get the same effect.
Yeah.
And Peter says developing and applying these tricks has been the main focus of mainstream applied economics over the last 3 decades. Oh dear.
Right. If you know anything about any of the basic science fields, if you conduct an experiment in order to have like an absolute conclusion about what you're studying, you have to be in control of all variables. Otherwise, you do not have a conclusion, just a guess.
Right.
There's no such thing as a natural experiment. You can't. That's why the social sciences have gone so far afield as well, is because they've done the same thing as what is now happening to economics, where they just take a population, can't control any of the variables, and try to statistics their way into a conclusion.
Okay, so yeah, he talks about the critics of this, of course, Austrian economists, chief among them. Well, we're not going to teach about Austrian economics here entirely, but basically, for Austrians, causality in social science is a theoretical construct, not something that can be teased out of the data without some a priori understanding of human behavior. Or to put it another way, the data does not speak on its own. Data is just data. You have to have some theoretical approach to make sense of what you're looking at. Otherwise, people tend to just sort of see what they want to in the data. Okay, so
Right.
the newer approaches herald a declining interest in theory in favor of what might be called crude empiricism. The move away from economic questions and toward issues that are small in the sense that they don't involve economic principles at all. And then he concludes with Lord Kelvin, the naive belief that science is all about measurement and that the data somehow speak for themselves, when in reality, empirical data are useful only in the way they are interpreted. They are interpreted by thinking, choosing, acting human beings. So yeah, I mean, I don't on Econ Minis. We're not going to go into a whole lecture about how Austrians think about this, but I
Right.
hope I've been able to appeal to your intuition, which is that you have to, you go out, global warming later, a year later it was warmer, and therefore the whole world is getting going to boil or whatever. Well, you've left a
Right.
lot of things out, right? I mean, obviously, you need to very carefully think about your data. Did you take the first measurement during the winter and the second in the summer? And on and on and on. There's so many things to consider, and it isn't so simple. Some people naively think you can just, I collect data and then the truth jumps out at me. But if you think deeply about it, you realize that it just doesn't work that way. Any comments, Ryan?
Right. I was just going to say near the beginning, you're reversing the order of operations by going to the data and then going to form a theory off of that instead of starting out a theory and going to the data. If I can go back to my Pythagoras example, it would be the equivalent of like if you brought supposedly a right triangle that didn't fit the theorem to like a mathematics professor or something, they aren't going to throw out Pythagoras' theorem. They're going to say you messed up somewhere because this theorem is theoretically correct. Like it is logically sound.
Right.
The same thing is happening here. In any science, economics, the social sciences, anything along those lines, you start with what you know, the logic, the theorems, the axioms, and then you collect data and make inferences if you are going to be empirical.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't even need the empiricism most of the time. So it's a complete corruption of what should be a very logical science.
Right, and notice that Ryan here is drawing an analogy between economic theory and geometry.
Yep.
Right, and just like with geometry, it's not irrelevant to the real world, as we know. Geometry really, really helps us in the real world. But you start with the geometric theory,
Axioms.
so to speak, the axioms, and then you bring that to the real world. Similarly, this is how Austrians view economics. You start with deductive axioms and deductions from axioms, and you bring that to the real world, and human action by Mises and Man, Economy, and State by Rothbard. They all function in this way. They start with basic axioms that are pretty undeniable, and they reason their way to the laws of economic theory. And then you come to the real world. It's not irrelevant at all, right? Economics really helps us understand the world. But at that point, you've got to be smart about applying it, and you've got to be smart about how you're analyzing your data and so forth. And you can't just throw theory out like the Nobel Prize winners have done and just start throwing data around and drawing conclusions. So anyway,
Right.
that's Nobel Prize. Let's keep moving. Is that okay, Rain? Off to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. Then one more, and then we'll hit the central bank stuff. Okay, so this is a conclusion of economics. I think I remember reading Man, Economy, and State by Rothbard and going, oh, that's counterintuitive, but, understanding his reasoning, I could see what's going on. Connor Mortel starts with a statement from, do you know how to say this lady's name? I don't watch TV news. Jen Psaki?
Saki, something like
Psaki?
that.
Okay. Yeah, White House press secretary. She's talking about Biden's intent to raise taxes on large companies. And she says there are some who argue that in the past, companies have passed on these costs to consumers. We feel that that's unfair and absurd, and the American people would not stand for that. So she's saying, you're claiming against us that this is going to hurt the consumers. Don't worry, it'll only hurt the companies. Hopefully you can see how there's problems right there. But anyway, we'll come back to that.
Right.
There's an economic claim here, which is that when you raise taxes on companies, it doesn't get passed to consumers. Well, the low IQ right-wingers jumped in and made their partisan points, and Dan Crenshaw said economics is hard, and, hey, she's stupid. Well, surprise, surprise, economics actually agrees narrowly with her narrow point here, which is that price is determined ultimately by the consumer. If the company could raise the price, why would they wait until their costs rose to do so? Yeah, right. So you just be passing profit up, right, Ryan? Go ahead.
Yes, when I when I first saw this article, it caught my eye because I'm currently having to take an accounting course, and I remember long ago, like I had dropped the theory before I even started talking online. I remember long ago I thought, well, if taxes increase, then prices must increase as well because the business will try to offset the losses from the tax and all of that. Now that I'm in accounting, and then before that when I was reading basic theory, they aren't going to do that because if I am in charge of a company, if I'm actually selling inventory or what have you, consulting, selling time, I'm going to charge the most that the consumer is willing to pay because that's just going to maximize profit. And that means if I do get taxed, I cannot raise it any higher because that I've already set it at the maximum feasible price, just from a pure accounting point of view. So in the most narrow sense, the secretary is correct that the accountants, the firms, aren't going to just pass this tax on to the consumers. They're going to get it in a different way. They're going to get the cost in a different way.
Right. So, yeah, he cites Man, Economy, and State to explain this. He says, I'll just read the whole section. The most popular example of a tax supposedly shifted to the consumer, is the general sales tax. For example, the government imposes a uniform 20% tax on all retail sales. And if we make the simplifying assumption that the taxes can be equally well enforced everywhere, then business will simply pass on the 20% increase in all prices to consumers. And you can kind of see the naive thought here, right? All competitors have to pay this 20, all the retail sellers are hit with the same 20% thing, and none of them can get around it, right? Let's just assume that.
Yeah, supposedly.
Well, then you wouldn't like undercut each other, right? You just all move your prices up by 20%. That's sort of the intuition, right? But he says, in fact, there is no way for prices to increase at all. As in the case of one particular industry, prices were previously set, or approximately so, at the points of maximum net revenue for the firms, max profit, right? Stocks of goods or factors have not yet changed, and neither have demand schedules. How can prices rise? So, what is he saying here? This comes down to this fundamental point in Austrian price theory, which is that the price is determined by the consumer and then works its way backward in the stages of production. The consumer is willing to pay a certain amount at the retail establishment, and therefore the retail establishment is willing to purchase that at wholesale at a certain level of wholesale prices, and therefore the wholesaler is willing to get it from the people who manufacture it at a certain price, and back and back and back all the way to raw materials and stuff like that, right? So in the Austrian view, then the valuation starts at the consumer and works its way backward into the production process. That's why this tax can't be passed on, right? Because the fact that you company, the retailer I'm buying from, or the wholesaler that feeds the retailer, suddenly have more taxes to pay the government, that doesn't make me want to pay more for your widget. That doesn't make the widget more valuable to me.
Right.
So
the basic way to put this is like I already have prices set to where I think the most amount of people will want to buy it at this price, and that's going to be the most profitable. A tax does not change that. It doesn't shift anything. It doesn't make people want to buy it more. It doesn't make it cost less. So if the government throws the tax at me, I can't just raise prices because now I am causing myself to lose money regardless. I'm just taking a loss either way.
Right. And then, let's see. Right. So he says, now that we have established that Psaki is not completely wrong to indicate that the American consumers could resist a price shift from the new tax, it leads to the question, why should we stop at whatever rate they are proposing? If it won't hurt consumers, why not keep taxing these businesses? Because that's sort of the underlying argument she's making, right? People have accused us of hurting consumers. No, but everybody calm down. We're just hurting businesses. Okay, great. Yeah, so if you're just hurting businesses and that's no problem for consumers, then, why stop at 20%? Just keep going, right?
Go to 100.
Go to 100, yeah. So here's what he says. Just as it is true that the consumer may not be willing to purchase at a higher price, it is also true that the producers may not be willing to provide the product at a higher cost, right? So there isn't some infinite ability to absorb the pain on the producer side, right? It could come from the government, it could come from their supply chain, right? The cost of this, the wholesale cost of this product got too high for us to be able to make any money selling it to consumers. So we pulled it off the shelves and we stopped ordering it from the wholesaler, right? And that could be because the wholesaler increased their price or because the government hit us.
Right. Or we shrunk it down and your shrink quantities, keep it at the same price, hope people don't notice.
Right. That's one of the effects we see of inflation, for example, is that to not alarm the consumers too much, they keep the retail price the size, and now it goes, as someone pointed out, as I pointed out in the show once, if you see a really strange weight to your candy bar, for example, like instead of 15 ounces or something like that, it's like 12.3. You might look back in the history of that product and find that at some point they did a little shrink on it. They're charging the same price, but they're giving you less.
So much in the same way with inflation, you can easily do the exact same thing here from the firm's point of view, at least.
Right.
Yeah. So, and then you can also go into broken window theory and all of that. Just what are you losing by the tax, and what are you losing from what you've lost, and you just keep going ad infinitum.
Right. Well, okay, but then Per Bieland, professor at what is it? Oklahoma State University.
Oklahoma State University.
I've heard that place. Okay, so Per Bieland has a book. This is drawn from his book, which is called "The Unrealized," "The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized," something like that. Anyway, probably a book we should cover with Professor Bieland if he would join us at some point. Anyway, let's quote from Professor Bieland to bring in another insight here. He's talking about regulations, but it's the same idea. It's a cost imposed by the government, whether it's a tax or regulation. It kind of doesn't matter, but it's a cost imposed on the producer, right, or on the entrepreneur.
Right.
So regulations are not what politicians promise. They are not actions to help the people. They are restrictions on entrepreneurs' economic behavior. Entrepreneurs are aiming at satisfying customers' wants as much as possible. Regulations aim to restrict this customer-satisfying action by forbidding certain innovations, or declaring that they must be designed and implemented in ways that have value for the regulator and not for the consumer or entrepreneur. Or they just hit the entrepreneur with the tax, right? Entrepreneurs are therefore forced to abandon some of their efforts to generate new value by satisfying customers, or to redirect their efforts into less value-producing channels. The potential output of their creativity goes unrealized. So, in the pure free market, the entrepreneur is using all of his resources, all the supplies, the supplies he can afford, all the ingenuity he can bring to bear, to get the best product out to the customer at the most profit-producing price, right? And then the government comes along and gives them regulations and taxes and so forth. And now the entrepreneur is hobbled from that activity. And they're not able to apply as much ingenuity. They're not able to use the nicer raw material. They have to go for the cheaper raw material, right? Any further comments? Someone's asked. I'm distracted because somebody asked me to link the book, and of course I should be linking all of this stuff. Okay.
I was just going to make the general claim, and I think it'll hold true in just about every regard, that any government action on the market, on entrepreneurs and producers, is just going to lower quality in some way, be it portion sizes, material quality, how long can it last, maintenance, you might not get people offering to maintain the product if you buy it anymore, because that's an extra cost that they can just cut. You can cut costs all over the place because you get taxed anywhere, and it's just going to lead to a general decrease in quality of a product and quality of service everywhere.
Yes. Okay, real quick, doing some links. Peter Klein on Nobel Prize, 2021 Nobel Prize. I didn't link that. Sorry, I'm behind on my links, and I like to always have these in the live chat so people can go check them out themselves. And then this is on
another
the,
point with
business tax.
Right. While you're doing that, another point with Dr. Bieland's book here that he also talked about, the Mises Institute, is that you will get in the pure market, the pure unregulated market, you're going to get people innovating, not necessarily even in technology, but also in service or production or things like that. Regulations are going to inhibit that and stop it from happening, as we just discussed in the quote earlier. And that, it's easy to see the direct effect. You don't get this one thing that was 1 degree away. But then you also don't get the things that come from that, that then come from that, and so on and so on. So every government regulation, it's not just preventing the one very obvious thing. It's preventing an unimaginable amount of things that came out of that could have increased the general welfare, could have increased profits, productivity, service, increased consumer satisfaction. Everything is just now unrealized.
Okay, let's throw in a horrifying thought experiment for a person in the IT field in computers like me. Let's imagine the vacuum tube industry had a total lock on Congress. It was, Congress was vacuum tube industry occupied territory back in the back in the day, right? And then microchip innovation came along, and there are already regulations in place. We cannot move away from vacuum tubes. Look at all the people's jobs who will be put out of business, or all the people who will lose their jobs who make vacuum tubes today. This cannot happen. And let's say that they strangled microchip manufacturing in its cradle, right? Just imagine, right? Just imagine the impact of that. Well, that sounds pretty extreme, right? But really, it's happening all the time.
Well,
it's happening all the time.
And with and they do this on larger products as well that you wouldn't even imagine. But they also do it on a million other smaller products as well. Right. If you try to go into any industry, for example, if you just very basic, try to found a corporation, like the legal distinction of corporation, you have in the U.S. about $3 million yearly annual regulation costs. So just the amount of money there that could have gone to literally anything else productive and efficient from every corporation, new startup or old money, is insane. It's unfathomable what we have lost at this point due to government regulation.
Yep. Okay. Anyway, what a great article. Linked in the live chat. I called it business tax. There's some nuggets of theory here that if you think through, you will understand a lot of what we're suffering under now. Okay, so we're gonna do a mini econ mini for once, I think, because we are now down to our central bank articles. We're gonna start with something that's a little bit just sort of a side note, but it's just sort of interesting, and then we'll get to our main point about the central banks. Robert Arrow, who's under I've gone blank. Anyway, he's on Twitter as econ something. It'll come to me. Was someone worth following. He Jeff Deist of the Mises Institute said this is our Fed guy. This is the guy who watches the Fed and keeps us updated on Mises.org and everything. So he actually sort of, so you don't have to. He actually reads the speeches that are given by Federal Reserve officials, and I don't know, does he get the minutes of the meetings? I don't know if those are public. Anyway, in this brief note on their blog, he talks about a central banker actually talking about the manipulation of data. And he says we should really give him credit because he really is honest about the problems here. So I thought this was quite interesting. And it just so happens it fits in nicely with our earlier theme about the Nobel Prize of how you've got to be really careful about data, right? To just say, hey, there's data. I can draw conclusions. Careful. Let's give you more caution, more warnings as we go through this. So a central banker discusses data manipulation, and let's get that article link in the chat. There we go. Okay. So he says, it's not often that a member of the Federal Reserve's inner circle ditches Fed speak in favor of something more honest. But one of the governors of the Federal Reserve, Christopher Waller, did exactly that in his speech titled The Economic Outlook and a Cautionary Tale on Idiosyncratic Price Changes and Inflation. By the way, the theme running through this is we could be missing it, but don't worry, inflation's temporary and it's not a big deal and it's not going to last and everything's going to be okay.
Right.
But he goes into some heavy nuance before he comes to that conclusion. Go ahead, Ryan.
Basic statistics here, which is what they're relying on, like even they're going to use things more complicated, but their basic methodology always goes back to the foundations. Statistically, it is very difficult to take a population and say for certain that something will happen. It's always, well, it's got this likelihood given this parameter and this specific population and this sample, but not for certain. So this is what the Fed is operating on for people that, aren't interested in the dry field of statistics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first of all, he raises the concerns, which we have raised on this show, right? He says inflation has been running higher this year than I and most forecasters expected. It has not been high for just a month or two. It's been high all year. So I assume he's talking about calendar year 2021, right? He mentions the price of lumber. I don't know if he used any lumber memes, but we have done that on this show, and how it has skyrocketed through May. He talks about used car prices. He talks about housing services such as rent. So seeing some price inflation across these areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says a lot of commentators, including me, have deflected concerns about high inflation readings being the result of outliers or idiosyncratic price movements. So people bring up lumber and used cars, and the response is, that's just kind of a weird product, and that's something sector specific, right? It doesn't indicate anything wider. Now, of course, that is perfectly possible, right? I mean, I don't know. Saudi Arabia drops in the sea, and suddenly oil prices spike because we're not getting any oil from Saudi Arabia. That's not a monetary effect, right? That's not because of the Fed printing a bunch of dollars. That's because Saudi Arabia fell into the sea. So there is such a thing as a sector-specific price jump.
Right.
What gets hard, right, is when they're saying time after time, oh, that's just sector. Oh, and that's sector specific. Oh, and that is also sector specific. It's like, well, eventually it's like, okay, how many sectors can be sector specific all at once, right?
Right, exactly. It happens across the board at about the same rate, but don't worry, it's sector specific.
Don't worry, it's sector specific, right? So he says, so this is allowed. He says this has allowed overall price increases to be downplayed for some time, or worse, the idea that as a result, recent high inflation readings are transitory and not broad-based. And he says, but there's a fallacy in doing so that one should avoid in judging whether higher inflation is indeed transitory. So this is really good what he does here. He's being a careful thinker. He's saying, now, maybe we're selling you a bill of goods here. Maybe we're being overly optimistic and we could be making mistakes. And he goes through, and this is the interesting part, he details the kinds of mistakes that could be made. And at the end, he's going to wave it away and say, but I think we've got it right. But let's listen to this. It's instructive. So, 4 highlights. First, if one used a trimmed mean measure of inflation, you would throw out the highest and the lowest readings for each year. Anyone who's played around with experimentation and stuff, that's one trick that you'll do. You know, I took a bunch of readings and there was a weird one. That's probably because that reading was screwed up somehow. Like, the data's weird. I took that reading wrong. It's such an outlier. I'm just going to throw that out. And also, I got this really low reading. That's an outlier too. I'm going to throw that out. It's a common technique, right?
Right.
Here's the problem. He says this may help in statistical modeling. The real world doesn't work this way, the author of the article says. If just one product or service that someone purchases has increased in value by an extraordinary amount, the individual can't throw out that item from their expenditure due to its high value. So they need fuel for their car, gas for heating their home. The fact that statistically that's considered an outlier doesn't help me pay my bills, right?
Right. And something else, just so that I don't rag entirely on the field of statistics this whole time, it's usually good practice to keep the outliers in the data set if they are indicating a trend, as in, well, this is an outlier here, but it's here for a reason. It's not like it wasn't a mess up. So if the Fed has been, doing these analyses and throwing out outliers, that would be extreme malpractice, which wouldn't surprise either of us if they were doing that, to be quite honest. But and that's why you keep those in, is because of things like this. This data is indicating real world things, so you don't just throw out the outlier because it screws up your normal distribution.
Right, exactly. So that's point number 1, throw out the high and the low. Okay, there's another thing you could throw out. He says, second way of manipulating the data is to say in year 1, look, inflation is being driven by good A, which had an idiosyncratic outsized price increase. It's sector specific or something like that. If you throw it out,
Mhm.
the underlying inflation rate is 2%. So there's this one good, it's weird. This sounds a lot like the first one, but in the first one, it just arbitrarily takes like highest and lowest and throws it out. Here it's focusing on a particular good and saying, that may not be the highest or whatever, but that seems to have a lot of weight here in our calculation of inflation. And it's just this one good, and we think something's sector specific. So we're going to throw that one good out in our inflation calculation, right? Of consumer price index
Right.
or producer price index. By selectively throwing out unusually high price increases, he explains how inflation data can be shaped to meet the goal of whomever is using the data, right?
Yep.
And there is one of the things we learn is that there is what Bob Murphy argued in a piece we covered on the show is that the trend tends to show up even in the official stats, but the absolute number of absolute inflation percentage tends to understate the reality
Right.
because of tricks like this, saying, well, energy prices are really going up, so we're just going to not count energy or not count it as much in our consumer price index. Right. There's tricks like that can be played and are played.
And that's how Bob Murphy can make the claim that inflation's going to spike at an insane percentage and be correct. And then you go see all these mainstream articles. They're saying, "How look at this guy who's wrong. The official inflation rate was only at like 2%. What a nut job."
Right.
And then he's over here, done his actual research, pulled in all the numbers, and he's like, "Well, actually, if you don't throw out all the inconvenient data, I was right."
Right.
And that's something you'll see as well. They slander that poor guy. If you go to his Wikipedia page, they have a whole article where it's just like wrong claims about inflation, and it's just like, well, according to the official data, which he was specifically arguing against here, he's wrong. So
yeah.
And they will do that to
Ryan,
all of you.
Ryan, this is the classic fact check, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, we have determined we're not guilty, so fact check, buddy. You're wrong. You know, officials have reported that the officials are okay. Okay, so third, one can justify throwing out good A in the first year by saying it did not reflect a broad-based price increase. Okay, so what's wrong with that? What you're trying to figure out is the impact of inflation. But if you just say, well, we kind of already know what inflation is, and that one good doesn't look like it's inflating according to what we think inflation is, do you see what I mean?
So this is the issue. They've thrown out theory, and they've relied on empirical values, which is what we covered at the start of this. Right. And now in place of their original axiom, they're doing an empirical analysis on something like inflation, and they're taking that specific number to be their foundation, and they're looking at everything else and being like, well, it doesn't fit our number, so it must be wrong. So they've got this empirical result, and they're treating it as the word of God, and instead of, perhaps
judging the
like
data.
Reasonable people relying on axioms. Yeah.
They're judging the data based on the data or something? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Then, with enough rationale, there really is no limit on just how much data can be manipulated or discarded entirely. This is the author saying this, to be fair, not the Fed guy. Okay, finally, he saves the most recognizable method until the end. And now we are back to quoting the Fed governor here. One could claim correctly that the large price increase for good A is transitory. It went up strikingly in year one, but then dropped back, meaning inflation should fall back to our inflation target in coming periods. But that will mislead you in terms of understanding the true inflation rate because you are putting zero probability that a large spike in inflation will happen to another good in the future. So we see the price spike up on good A in January, and then it spikes up on good B in February and good C in March. And this method says, these are just all transitory things. What are you talking about? There's no inflation.
Yeah, they're not linked at all.
Right. And of course, that would be the assumption that there's an underlying assumption there, which is that inflation would be simultaneously reflected across all sectors, all goods at the same time. But we know from Cantillon, the Cantillon effect, right? We know from Cantillon that that's not how it works. Inflation works its way through the system. and so you see it show up at different
Exactly.
times in different places. So that actually is normal. That is the normal propagation of inflation through the economy. And if you're going to just say, well, that happened there, but later it happened over here, and dismiss all that, well, you've just dismissed how inflation actually works. So that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, hilariously, they've identified specifically the Cantillon effect in their own data analyses. They've just rejected that that's what it is. So I mean,
Right.
they've kind of doing half of the work for us, but also corrupting it in the process.
Right. So just to wrap this one up, he says we can applaud Waller for all that honesty, telling us the games that can be played with data, and sometimes are. But then he comes back around and says, all that said, I am still greatly concerned. Oh, no, I'm sorry. He says, I continue to believe that the escalation of inflation will be transitory and that inflation will move back toward our 2% target next year. So, yes, all of these things could be happening, but don't worry. I think we're right, and inflation is not going to continue, right? Price inflation is what he's talking about.
Yeah.
That said, he says, I am still greatly concerned about the upside risk that elevated inflation will not prove temporary. Okay, now he calls this, the author of the article at Mises calls this Fed speak, and maybe that's because he says, it'll be fine, but I'm kind of concerned it won't be fine. What?
Yep.
This is like the way politicians talk, right? Wait, what does
Well,
that add
yeah,
up
and
to? What do those two statements combined add up to? It's like matter and antimatter, it just explodes? I don't know, right?
You have to, if you are centrally controlling something, which is what the Fed does, we'll get there, you have to speak like that, because at that point, with your limited knowledge, you're relying on probabilities, and you're never going to be certain. So
Right.
he's looking at these probabilities, and he's like, well, there's an all right probability that we'll be fine, but on the other hand, we could just crash. So, like, what he's saying there, I mean, it's perfectly understandable if you're at his desk, but
Right.
should the desk be there in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. So then finally, from the author of the article at Mises, he says, the problem is not the statistical technique or the calculation itself. Rather, is that these techniques, the 4 points that were made, is that these techniques are then used to make real-world decisions, often devoid of economic theory or consideration for any semblance of reality. So they make the statistics look nice, they get their bell curve, whatever. Meanwhile, out here in real life, we're paying more for fuel, we're paying more for rent, we're paying more for lumber, right? And we're feeling the real-world impacts, while they're saying everything's fine, right? The dog in the burning room meme, right?
Right.
It's all fine.
And another thing you can do in statistics is that if you are proven wrong with your previous result, you can just release a new one with different parameters and say, well, everything's fine now because I've altered the parameters. And this is what the government will do to you all the time. And it's a very, very sneaky trick, and it's very corrupt and unethical.
I have not made enough of our graphic designer, who not only brings professionalism, but a sense of humor and fun. I'll describe, like in this case, it was my idea. Sometimes it's the producer's idea or Ryan's or whatever, or the graphic designer's. But Andrew, our graphic designer, in this case, I kind of roughly described what I wanted him to do, and then I saw what he made and I laughed. This is very common. It's we have great fun with these things, and I don't give him enough credit or feature enough. So anyway, I just wanted to put this on the screen for a moment. Our Commie Banks thumbnail for today with Karl Marx on the $1 bill. And if you look close, if you're on a bigger screen instead of your phone, you can see some fun little commie symbols mixed in here and there throughout the this. Anyway, it's great fun. It makes a serious point, and that point is that the Communist Manifesto, I'm not kidding, the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, has a numbered list of planks, demands, whatever you want to call them. This is what it would mean to implement communism, right? What we're calling for in the manifesto. And they number, and they're short. It's actually quite readable. Each one's like a phrase or a short sentence. And number 5 is the central bank, established central banks, which didn't exist at the time of the Communist Manifesto. And now, shall we say, they do exist, right? So we're going to learn more
Right.
about that. Any comments before we leave the thumbnail? Right.
Yeah, to say I'm looking at it on a bigger screen now that's not my phone while I'm walking through wind-torn Oklahoma. This is a hilarious image. There's a lot of cool little things hidden throughout.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to feature it. It's like give people a chance to study the details.
Yeah.
It's really, really great work. Thanks, Andrew, for your work for the show every week. Okay, so why do I call them Commie Banks? We're going to get towards that. We're going to do 2 more articles to wrap this show up. They're both about the central bank and what it means. We're going to start with the master himself, Ludwig von Mises, after whom the Mises Institute is named. When I say the Mises Institute, I'm usually referring to the one that I've been to a gazillion times in Auburn, Alabama. But since the early days, the Mises Institute has inspired the creation of Mises Institutes around the world. So I'm pretty sure there's one in the Czech Republic. There's one in Austria now, I think. Austria itself, where the Austrian school started. I'm
Awesome.
quite sure there's one in Brazil, and some of the people there ended up in
Yep.
the Bolsonaro regime, right? And on and on and on. So this is an international school of economic thought, and it's quite heartening from the early days when it felt like we were a little bit alone back there decades ago. So, monetary policy and the present trend towards central planning. I'm not going to go into great detail, but this is from a later edition, a chapter that Mises added much later to his landmark book, Theory of Money and Credit, which is, as it says at the bottom of this article, which I'm going to share the link to right now in the live chat, just remembered. As it says in the bottom of this article, that is the book that put Mises on the map as an economic thinker. He went from, I think,
Right.
not particularly well known to greatly respected based on just that one book. And then, of course, that was just the beginning. And he produced so much great work as an economist since Theory of Money and Credit. Right?
Right. On the topic of that book in particular, the name can be a bit of a misnomer because it
Yeah.
sounds like it's going to be very dry calculations and all of that. But actually, I've actually talked to Dr. Beeland about it quite a lot. The name is kind of a mistranslation. There's a lot of better ways to phrase it. So the topic may sound a bit dry, may sound a bit daunting. It's actually a very good, very readable book, to be quite honest.
Yes. Mises is very clear, by the way.
Yes.
If you're thinking he spoke and wrote originally, at least in German, he must write in a way that is like serpentine and incomprehensible, like Hegel or somebody like that. That's not what Mises.
Right.
That's not what Mises was like. Maybe his sentences are a little on the long side sometimes, but I find him he's an extremely rigorous and logical thinker, and it comes through in his prose. His prose is very clear,
Right.
very precise, and we're going to experience that. This is actually by Mises himself. So, monetary policy and the present trend towards central planning. The destruction of the monetary order was the result of deliberate actions on the part of various governments. The government-controlled central banks, and in the United States, the government-controlled Federal Reserve System, were the instruments applied in this process of disorganization and demolition. So this did not happen by accident. The Creature from Jekyll Island is a book that talks about the beginning of the Federal Reserve here in the United States. People connived together secretly. We got to do this thing because it's going to benefit us. It's a form of plunder, just to give away the ending. We're going to rip
Right.
everybody off, and this is how we're going to do it. And then they got their friends in Congress to pass it, and this is the system we're saddled with now, and in the U.S. and around the world. Just in case you think Mises can't be funny in his own way, I just wanted to share this sentence. These 2 sentences. Yet without exception, all drafts for an improvement of currency systems assign to the governments unrestricted supremacy in matters of currency and design fantastic images of superprivileged superbanks. Superprivileged superbanks. Even the manifest futility of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, does not deter authors from indulging in dreams about a World Bank fertilizing mankind with floods of cheap credit. Okay, anyway. So, he says the goal of all of this, of these policies, is to substitute planning, scare quotes, I'm going to say them because that's important, The goal of their policy is to substitute planning for the alleged planlessness of the market economy. The term planning, as they use it, means, of course, central planning by the authorities, enforced by the police power. It implies the nullification of each citizen's right to plan his own life. Now, I don't remember if I saw this first in Hayek or Mises. They both make this point, and it's so important because it's a little rhetorical trick there, right? When we plan, when we in the government or the experts or whatever plan, that's planning. When you guys plan,
right,
we don't even refer to that as planning. There's just
exactly
there's planning or there's no planning, and I think it was Hayek who said the choice isn't between plan and no plan. The choice is who is going to plan. Is it going to be us?
Right, exactly.
Or is it going to be the regime and the experts, right?
Right. So whenever you have these central banks and the politicians that will use this rhetoric, like a set, stable, strong government plan or a central banking plan or the Federal Reserve or something, they're going to plan it for us because the unregulated market is too chaotic and unplanned to actually coordinate anything. It's very insulting, and it's a very great rhetorical trick to anyone that owns a business and any person that actually plans through maybe their purchases in their life or something like that. Because, how many plans do you as an individual have day to day? And then if you're running a company, how many more do you have? The government, the politicians, the Federal Reserve is just telling you those don't count as plans because they aren't coming from us.
Right. Exactly.
It's a great rhetorical victory for them, and it's also extremely insulting, and it kind of needs to be broken down.
Absolutely, yes. It's always worth calling out the language games, as academic agent has taught us. Okay, so Mises says planning does not differ from the social system that Marx advocated under the names of socialism and communism. It transfers control of all production activities to the government and thus eliminates the market altogether. So he says there's no difference between the United States government has a 5-year plan and the USSR having a 5-year plan. In both cases, it's transferring control. It's letting the government plan rather than we, the market, or just us, right? Voluntarily cooperating together and having our own plans. Go ahead.
Right, and something else that might be alluded to in that sentiment, it's no different if the U.S. or the USSR has a 5-year plan. About the same time when both governments started doing that, they were very sympathetic towards the same thinkers and the same policies. So it's not just in an economic sense or a material sense, but also in a political sense and a very metaphysical sense in terms of whenever we had our bout with central planning in its extremity, we had a communist sympathizer in the White House for 4 terms that was actively propping up the Soviet Union just by giving them stuff. And the Soviet Union also was doing the same thing in countries elsewhere. So there's a lot here that's very typical with Mises. There's a lot here in this one sentiment, this one idea, much more than will be at first on the surface.
Right. Now, he does give a caveat. He says, although the present trend of economic policies leads towards socialism, the United States and some other countries have still preserved the characteristic features of the market economy. And so Rothbard asked him once, I've shared this before, but keep sharing it. Rothbard asked Mises once, okay, so there's like a spectrum, right? Where you have, full out, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, where they're trying to abolish money and doing full war communism and everything, right? And then later you have the new economic policy, and they backed off from being totally over there. And then you have, the very mixed economy, and then you have the really free market over on the other end. And Rothbard said, when do you tell whether you have a market economy? However compromised, but it's still a market economy. And Mises said simply, stock market. When you have a stock market, you have a market economy. So that's part of what he's getting at when he says the characteristic features of the market economy.
And before anyone jumps to conclusions, that's not necessarily the stock market as it exists today, although it is a stock market. The one that we have today is very regulated and very has a lot of barriers to entry that have been organized by the government for their cronies, for their oligarchs. It doesn't mean West as you see it today. It just means our people trading stock with each other, trading shares in businesses and all of this other, the very basic fundamental definition of a stock market.
Now, as you can see, Ryan, from my highlights, I was going to skip the bit about the fair deal because I don't know American history as well as you, and I don't know what the fair deal was. Do you?
There was the New Deal. There were multiple
the New Deal is Hoover, and then the second New Deal is FDR. I know that.
FDR, yeah.
What's the
before that? Hold on. Before that, we even had something called the Square Deal, which was Teddy Roosevelt and his trust busting thing.
Okay.
The Fair Deal was kind of the it was our version of the post-war consensus.
Got it. Okay.
We had Truman, and then after Truman, Eisenhower, different parties, basically the exact same in policy across the board. Mm-hmm. After Eisenhower, we have Kennedy. After Kennedy, we have Johnson, and then finally, it's ended by Nixon, who does his own thing that was a bit wrong in economic terms. The Fair Deal is kind of that era of those four presidents, very neoliberal and borderline socialist with Truman, who called himself a socialist multiple times.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so Truman was the left extreme. He wanted to nationalize the steel mills. He wanted to boost the minimum wage to insane levels. He wanted to do all these different welfare things, a lot of foreign aid, which actually did happen, a lot of intervention to get more people on our foreign aid, increasing their dependency on us. And then on sort of the right-leaning part of it, you have Eisenhower, who kind of scaled it back a lot, but really liked the social welfare ideas. So not going out and nationalizing the steel mills, but really upping, social welfare, really upping international aid, all of this other stuff.
Right. So from an economics point of view, this sounds like the "we're all Keynesians now" period after the World War II, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So he talks about that a bit, and he says, in this great conflict, the advocates of public control, the ones who want to do all this central planning, cannot do without inflation. This is why I wanted to share this article. This is the key point here. Inflation is a necessary tool for the social engineers and the central planners. Why?
Yep.
They need it, Mises writes, they need it in order to finance their policy of reckless spending and of lavishly subsidizing and bribing the voters. So this is how they pretend to give us free stuff. Of course, it's not free, as we know, right? But they're able to make it appear free through the dark magic of inflation. And then this really struck me because, go ahead.
I was going to say, think back to our war and inflation videos, the exact same concept just being applied to something that isn't warfare.
Right. Yeah, exactly. This really struck me because we've got this news about the unrealized gains. Did you see that, Ryan? They're going to tax unrealized gains.
So I was on top of that because I can't think of a better policy to put the serfs in their place, keep the oligarchs in power, and fund reckless things all in one go.
Right. So somebody made a great point about that, but Mises has it right here. He says, the illusory profits which the inflationary falsification of economic calculation makes appear are dealt with as if they were real profits. In taxing them away under the misleading label of excess profits, parts of the capital invested are confiscated. So he says inflation makes it look like everybody's making money, and then they say, oh, well, we got to take some of that. Government's got to have a piece of that. It's a way to eat away at everybody, and in particular, as you point out, to particularly target enemies of the regime, which seem to be small businesses, and it seems like, based on what we saw last year. Okay, want to keep moving because I want to make sure I know we're on a time limit. I want to make sure we give that last article its due. In spreading discontent and social unrest, inflation generates favorable conditions for the subversive propaganda of the self-styled champions of welfare and progress. So he's saying that inflation causes problems, and then they use those problems to say, look what the market economy does. We've got to fix it with our programs and our welfare, and right? So they cause a problem
It's
with
the
inflation and blame the market.
right. It's the guy that's riding the bicycle and he throws the bar into it while he's going, and he blames something else. Right. It's the
Exactly.
exact same
Yeah.
thing.
That meme. Yeah.
So
Okay. So while advocating high prices and wage rates as a panacea and praising the administration for having raised the national income, of course expressed in terms of a depreciating currency, to an unprecedented height, they blamed private enterprise for charging outrageous prices and profiteering. So you cause monetary inflation. You cause inflation through monetary manipulation. And then when somebody has to raise their prices, you blame them for doing that. And you say, look what you're
right.
doing. You're squeezing you dirty capitalists, you're squeezing the poor people who just want to buy their groceries.
Right. And inflation does impact the price. It's not exactly like a sales tax, just to keep things straightened out.
And then I love this line. He
Yeah.
says statesmen have had the audacity to contend that capitalism creates scarcity. Of course, the 20th century, anyone stepping back and just looking at the big picture of the 20th century, where were the bread lines, right? They were in they were during the depression in the U.S. because of the Fed, but generally they were in communist countries. Where were the famines, the general famines, which had ceased by the end of the 19th century throughout Europe? Where were the general famines? They were wherever communism reigned, right? To this day,
Right.
North Korea, I think, deals with famines. But before that, Cambodia, the Soviet Union, communist China under Mao, they all experienced general famines. That means people are dying from hunger all over the place.
Right. And something else, you also had wartime socialism as well, which isn't necessarily, people waving the red banner and cheering on Lenin. You would also have rationing in places that went to war, and it turns out that warfare is really going to restrict what should actually happen. So you had famines in the United Kingdom when it basically implemented what was war socialism. In the British Raj, you had central planning of food, caused a famine. Who could have guessed it? It's across the board. It's always these policies.
Okay, so again, hitting this point. Self-styled progressives cannot do without inflation. They cannot and never will accept a policy of sound money. So it seems a little geeky, I think, sometimes to people that, the gold bugs and the Austrians, why do they keep going on about money? What's the deal? Why do they hate the Fed? Well, this is a central enabling mechanism to undermine society, and in its place have war and social engineering. That's why this is such a big deal, right? He says what they mean is not to end the policy of increasing the quantity of money in circulation, but to establish price control. That is, futile schemes to escape the emergency arising inevitably from their policies. So this is the flow that you'll see over and over again. There's inflation, they deny it, they say, it's a good thing after all. I've been saying that lately. Inflation is good.
Yeah, me too.
It'll make people think, about how they spend their money and stuff like that. They go through all that cycle, and then finally they start blaming the profiteer. And they say, we've got to establish price controls because otherwise these dirty capitalists are going to squeeze everybody for everything they're worth, right? One leads to another every time. And this has happened, by the way, in like ancient Rome. Like this pattern is really old. There's a book that the Mises Institute has on their store that documents this throughout history. Go ahead.
Right. And just on first a macro and then a micro scale, look at how central banking and inflation in particular, centrally planned inflation, look at how that will influence the society at large, like your social engineering point. If you have, and people know that there's going to be inflation because the Fed keeps printing money, it's really going to lower their time preference or heighten their time preferences because, you gotta get it now before it goes up in price, before your money's worth less, et cetera, et cetera. And then on a really small scale, look at what it will do to people's purchasing habits as well. It's going to price out certain people because the Fed's going to let them go under, or the politicians are going to let this business go under, and they're going to favor this industry over here. Now, if people literally are not producing what that first industry was, You can no longer have that, and it's going to influence the culture and the people and the society at large. So that's
Yep.
just two ways that this is going to impact you, and there are many more to go through.
Okay, let's wrap this one up. There cannot be stable money within an environment dominated by ideologies hostile to the preservation of economic freedom. That is, he's saying, if you think you're going to do a little trick and just, fight the Fed and get rid of the Fed, and then everything else will sort itself out, well, it's not going to take very long. You might trick them for a moment. I don't know. Probably not. But the progressives are going to very quickly figure out that we have got to have that central bank inflating, or we can't do all of our crazy schemes. We'll talk
Right.
about what one of those are in just a more modern incarnation of central planning in a moment in the next article. Monetary reconstruction presupposes, first of all, total and unconditional rejection of those allegedly progressive policies which in the United States are designated by the slogans New Deal and Fair Deal. So he's saying, sorry, there are no shortcuts, which makes it sound impossible, I know, but we have got to undermine that whole ideology if we're ever going to get back to sound money and a reasonably functioning economy. Okay.
Right.
I shared that article. Let's share the next. So this is from Guido Holzmann, great guy who teaches in France. And this article, I'm going to skip to the bottom real quick. This article actually was just published in Epoch Times, in the German edition of the Epoch Times in October of this year, so this month. Okay, central banks and socialism are forever linked together. Thus, you can see our thumbnail, right? Commie Banks.
Right.
Okay, segueing right from what Mises was just saying. Socialism is a shortage economy. It is the economy of inefficiency and corruption, of indifferent workers and of bigwigs, of lacking spare parts, of lacking funds, of failure, of permanent reform needs, and of constantly unsuccessful reforms. And he says, of course, this applies to the Soviet Union or under National Socialism, but it is no less evident in the partial socialisms that we have in our real existing welfare states today. Budget deficits year in, year out, despite high contributions. That is the reality in the state pension system and in the state health system. The state education system is similar. Declining student performance and growing illiteracy despite skyrocketing expenditure. Go to Ryan's channel to learn more, which is in the description. Let's keep on subscribing to Ryan. Only those
release a new video soon.
Yeah, right. Inspire you. Only those who have a legal monopoly and can make use of taxpayers' money, if necessary, do not need. I'm sorry, I didn't give the context for that. Yeah, no private entrepreneur could afford to let the costs get out of hand. Anyone who is in competition has to keep improving. Only those who have a legal monopoly and can make use of taxpayers' money, if necessary, do not need it. Do not need to watch costs, right? Now,
Right.
Having established that, there's socialism as a shortage economy, even partial socialisms, the welfare states we all probably everybody on listening to the show suffers under, even they face the same kinds of problems, right? Now let's turn to the big one. Now there is one partial socialism that stands out from the usual array of failures. Here we see gains. He should have put it in scare quotes. Here we see gains instead of losses. Here we often find all the other signs of a successfully run company, from the private legal form to the private pinstripe-filled boardroom. We are talking about central banking. And the term central bank actually refers quite clearly to a centrally planned economy. But when people talk about the Fed, the European Central Bank, other central banks, hardly anyone thinks that they are talking about an offspring of the socialist spirit. On the contrary, central banks are typically viewed as particularly capitalist. After all, what would be more capitalist than money? And what would be more closely related to money than a bank? So it's really funny to see far left folks that I follow will occasionally actually say something against the Fed because they see it as a capitalist institution, not realizing that it's plank 5 of the Communist Manifesto, which we'll read in a moment. So he says the central bank, unlike a lot of these other things like welfare, I think it's fair to say that the champions of the free market have been able to paint welfare programs as not really being free market things. Like even people who support them, they'll say it in the way of like, well, I generally am for the market, but I do support universal health care. They know that they're not talking about the free market when they talk about a welfare program, right?
Right.
But what Guido's saying here is that with the central bank, sometimes people are tricked because of sort of the surface appearance of it. Oh yeah, this is a capitalist institution. And Guido's saying, no, it isn't. It's not at all. It's the very opposite of it. Okay, in the unbridled market economy, private property and competition prevail. So that's the market. There's private property and there's competition. So now let's compare the central bank to that. Central banks, on the other hand, are state institutions, so they're not private. And he deals with this thing. Some people run around and say that because the Federal Reserve in the United States, it turns out Japan, Switzerland are structured differently, because they're structured as they're not agencies of the government legally. They're like private organizations. That therefore they're not really run by the government, but Guido deals with that. He says
they're independent.
Yeah, they're independent. Right. The independent central banks. He says, no. They're subject to special laws. Their directors are appointed by national governments. He says, don't be fooled by that crap. The central banks in the U.S. as well are the central bank of the United States as well is also a state institution. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah. Duh.
Yeah. Central banks always and everywhere enjoy a legal monopoly. So remember, in the free market, you have private property, you have competition. The central banks are everywhere state institutions, maybe done in a tricky manner, but they're all state institutions, and they don't face competition. They're a legal monopoly. Their banknotes and their deposit money are largely withdrawn from free competition. The market participants are compelled to use the money of the central banks. So that's what we mean. This is the legal tender laws, I think, is the relevant thing.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you literally can't make a different currency. Okay. Technically, the law says you can't make any currency that resembles United States official currency. But in practice, what that means is, it's a currency, therefore it resembles the U.S. official currency. You can't have that, and then they will break into your house, seize all of your property by asset forfeiture, and sell it off, and then you're thrown in jail for however long. They will ruin you for doing this, and they have before.
Yep.
And that's why, if you've been thinking before, you might have had the idea, the dollar's terrible. Why don't we just print our own gold coins and switch over to that? Well, it's illegal.
Right. It's literally illegal. Yeah.
Yeah. People are doing a great job with cryptocurrency, because they have the very good caveat that has been unbeaten so far in the U.S. legal system that it's online. Can't resemble the U.S. physical currency.
Right.
So,
okay. Oh, anything else? Sorry.
No, that was it.
Okay.
It's just a really draconian system.
Yep. Okay, so they aren't a free market institution. They don't face competition. They're not based on private property. That's called not being the market. Okay. Now, let's again give a contrast. The production of money by private commercial banks is limited by their equity capital and also by the cash deposits of their customers. But central banks don't need equity or cash deposits. It is they who create cash, right? So again, they're called a bank. They have the word bank in the title, but don't be fooled by that. Someone in the comments said, Dave Bertrand, he says the name of it tricks people. It's called a bank. Well, it's a bank then, right? Well, the Patriot Act wasn't patriotic. Wake up, buddy. Sorry, Dave Bertrand throws in a great comment. They even made barter illegal in Germany back in the day because people tried to get around money. That's amazing. Okay, anyway. He says certain legal limits are set for the central banks, but in times of crisis, as in the real estate crisis in the United States in 2008, 2009, and last year and this year with the lockdowns, 2020 to 2021, these limits can be relaxed quickly and dramatically. If necessary, they can also be abolished entirely. So these limits are not the hard limits that we face in the market. where if we run at a loss, we go out of business. If the central bank wants to go hog wild here, the state just says, "Oh, it's an emergency. Forget all those limitations we put on you. Just go crazy. Print money to your heart's content." So they have potentially tremendous power, the central banks. If only let loose, they can control all the economy and society. Now, how is that they could control so much? Just this one thing, the central bank. Well, that's because there's no limit to the number of new loans they can issue. And they can provide these loans to some and deny them to others, and by implication, they can also control the use of all available resources. Labor moves where it's best paid. Raw materials and capital goods are sold to those who offer the highest prices. Well, guess what? If you control the printing press, you can let the real resources flow exactly where you think it is right. So the central bank can centrally plan the whole economy.
Right. Basically,
Right?
if you want an analogy, what they've done is they've mandated, like, it's like a body, and they've taken the blood supply and they've put it in charge of the heart, and the heart in this case gets to direct where it can go. So in this case, if you anger the heart, you're not going to get blood, you're going to die. Back to the actual case, the Federal Reserve, you're mandated to use their dollars while you are here. You can't use a different currency unless it is officially recognized and controlled probably by another central bank. And they're cracking down on the cryptocurrencies. Haven't got there yet. There's a possibility they will stay alive. You have to use these dollars, these coins, worthless, and they also get to control where it goes, how much of it is there, and who gets loans and who doesn't. So they control the blood flow, essentially, and the blood supply.
So, Guido says, central banks are made for do-gooders. He who runs a central bank does not need to do painstaking educational work in order to bring about any social change. The humanitarian with the printing press can finance all changes he wishes for at the push of a button. He can just pay other people to do what he wants. As long as he has the printing press under control, he could by and large not give a damn about what other people think or wish. So he's saying, we're used to all this propaganda trying to convince us that this is the way that things should be done, and we should all go along with the plan of the day, the 5-year plan of the day. He's saying the central bank can just make everybody do it, in essence, by manipulating the money. He said the Saint-Simonians in France, who are, if you read Hayek on the Saint-Simonians, they're amusing, shall we say. The Saint-Simonians in France had already grasped this at the beginning of the 19th century. That is, the economy of a country can be controlled with the help of the printing press. And then he cites the Communist Manifesto, Plank 5, as I mentioned. A few years later, after the Saint-Simonians, the demand for the, quote, centralization of credit in the hands of the state through a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, close quote, soon also held center stage in the 1848 Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. So the central bank is literally a commie bank. I mean, I do this stuff to be attention-getting and to be fun, right? But I try to also be 100% accurate and not clickbait.
Right.
I hope Commie Banks got your attention. But I mean it. I totally mean it. It's a commie bank in every sense you can think of, including Marx and Engels themselves calling for the creation of it.
Right, and Marx and Engels have their own rhetorical flourishes that they put along with it. They call for a worker-owned central bank, which is not quite what we have. However, both function the exact same way. So the only place where Marx and Engels would disagree with Yellen and all the other people, clowns in government right now, is who controls it, not what it's doing. So just keep that in mind.
This next bit, my friends in the UK tell me, I was like, why was somebody surprised that this historian was cited in a Mises article? And they said, oh, well, this bit of what he says is considered a little spicy. Well, that's exactly what Guido brings up. So listen to this. The enormous possibilities of creating money from nothing have been used again and again to finance state industrial policy and socialist experiments. In the 1970s, British historian Anthony Sutton reported that some of New York's Wall Street banks had financed the radical transformation of traditional European societies. They supported Lenin and Stalin. Academic Agent and I covered this on one of his streams, that Wall Street was backing the Bolsheviks. They supported Lenin and Stalin, as well as Adolf Hitler, with billions of dollars. That would not have been possible without the refinancing from the American central bank. So he's saying the central bank can be used as a social engineering mechanism. And now he's saying, in fact, it has been used that way. It has been used to radically transform European societies in the past. And we still have these central banks around, and they still get used. In fact, what's next for us? This time, it appears in the form of a green and egalitarian transformation of the economy and society. Build back better, baby. That's what Guido's bringing up, right? The directors of the European Central Bank and the Fed have already officially committed to this. As we called out in the show, it blew my mind. It is now part of the objectives of the Federal Reserve to transform the economy into a green economy, or whatever that crap is. Like, why would the central bank have
and
goals about the structure of the economy? Like, what? It's still kind of shocking, even for me.
They'd be regulated to...
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, you think they'd be regulated to monetary policy, but they have all of this green stuff. It might seem way out there. It seems like social policy, but in reality, what that translates into is they are going to completely destroy your standard of living, and they are going to completely isolate you unless they give you the go-ahead by restricting your fuel types. They're going to restrict your food quantity and quality. They're going to restrict your electricity usage. So how much people out there across the ocean can you talk to, on top of 4 billion other things that you can do with electricity. Now that we put it in terms of resources and quantity, sounds a lot like the central bank would be involved in this.
So the new humanitarians with the printing press are undoubtedly a great danger to humanity. They threaten everyone's prosperity by channeling scarce resources into unprofitable and therefore unsustainable uses. Green central policy is not to be condemned primarily because it supposedly pursues ecological goals, but because a central bank comes into its own here. I think what he's saying here is, don't get distracted by arguing about, don't let yourself be put in the place of, you don't care about the environment, and that's why you don't support it. No. We care about the economy not being a communist economy, right? Taken over, the whole economy being directed and engineered and manipulated by central planning in the shape of whatever it is they want to do today. Today it's green crap, right? But tomorrow it'll be some other fad or trend. What it'll mean, though, is control.
Exactly, and that's what it always boils down to. But even then, say you do care about the environment, your just the place around, your land around you, water quality, and all of that. You do not want the government in charge of that, because every single time that they have that in their pocket, they ruin it. And then whenever the government inevitably goes down, there is no one there left, no successor, they aren't left to actually fix it. It's left to you to fix their mistakes whenever they destroy your land, destroy your water, destroy your resources, every single time.
So, finishing up this article, the economists of the Austrian school have shown, among other things, that central banks always and everywhere weaken economic growth by undermining the propensity to save, because you need real savings to have genuine, sustainable economic growth. They are destabilizing the economy by fueling a debt economy. They incite greed and avarice, and they create blatant inequalities in income and wealth. Central banks cannot be reformed. They must be abolished. So kind of ironic, right? That last bit about inequalities, because supposedly communism was supposed to bring us equality, I think. I think that was part of one of their goals. Well, and here we see Plank 5 is encouraging something that in actual practice yields inequality. So commies should hate the central bank. They should just hate it for the right reason.
Right. Just a final thought here, and then something after that as well. When they mismanage everything, when they have complete control over your life and transportation, your food, resources, fuel, you will be equal when you're dead. The other thing that I wanted to talk about as well, economic growth or sustainable economic growth, whatever you want to call it, either of them, it's not just a line on a graph, especially when you're talking to us, who will factor out, government spending and the typical line on the graph. Economic growth is the well-being of people in material terms, and it can also be inferred as the well-being of people in other terms as well, because these are people being productive, and provided in that pure unregulated idealistic market, people being unregulated is going to allow people to it's going to have stronger community bonds. It's going to have actual productivity for things that people want and need, and it's going to cut down on waste and actually give something good.
Right. Yeah. The social engineering pushes people away, it seems to me, from genuine community. It weakens the family.
Right.
Right. It weakens. Here's a good example. Welfare weakens that intergenerational bond.
Exactly.
That, the parents give to their children when they're little, and then the children support their parents when they're old. Well, we don't need that anymore. We've got Social Security, right? And
exactly.
Yeah.
I was yelling into the void about this on Twitter earlier today. The current model where people just kick out their children at the age of 18 and then they're left on their own, and then they never really interact too terribly much outside of that. It's a very new phenomenon. Previously, depending on where in Europe you were, you'd have the nuclear family, which the family the family stays close together. They are still a family, but they don't live with each other necessarily. The children will go out and have their own households, but they are still nearby. They're still a family unit, even onto the multi-generational scale. You have the authoritarian family, which was more common in Germany and parts of France, if I remember correctly, where the oldest child or the oldest male child, depending, will stay with the family, and the rest of the children will go off, similar to the nuclear family, have their own households. Still one multi-generational family unit, and then you have the the communitarian family, which is all in one household. Whenever you get central banks, whenever you get Social Security, these things no longer happen because people no longer see the need to do them. And then you've also weakened things like the church. You've weakened things like the actual family authority itself. People don't want to listen to their family anymore. It dissolved all of this, and it started something that I called the atomic family, where people are they are themselves, and they have no relations to their family. They have no need to do it, at least in their perception. And it completely destroys the bonds that we just listed through.
Right. So there's two things that annoy me when right-wingers talk about liberalism or libertarianism as being about atomistic individualism.
Right.
They say often in very different ways, but that's the basic point they're making. There's two things annoy me. First, that's a slander that came from Karl Marx himself. Marx is the one that made up that charge, right? He's the source of that charge.
Yes.
So they're repeating Marx. Number two, it's exactly the opposite of the truth. It's in fact socialism and communism and collectivism, state collectivism, that generates the atomistic individualist problem that you just described. And it's the private property market that yields stronger family bonds, stronger community bonds, and so forth, right?
Right. And if you go back to last week's show, you can see how that comes about in much greater detail, how these bonds come about as a result of non-intervention.
Right. Okay. So let's see. I think we just have one. No, we have two at least things to cover. And then I think we're going to be on time for you. Right, Ryan?
Yeah, I think so. It's worked out very well.
Good. Well, over on Subscribestar, where we get a lot of great support for the show. Thanks, everyone. Ike Broflovsky sent one in a couple days ago about last week's show, but I didn't want to forget to read it on air. Liberty versus Democracy, last week's show, was one of your best streams so far. I also looked up that test from 1895. This is a test that's like a fifth grade test from 1895.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I looked up that test from 1895. I can only pass the arithmetic section. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. A fun thing to do. I looked over it myself. It's quite the test. Okay, and then I think we have one super chat to read from Mickey the Fourth. He says, "This Nobel Prize, effectively denying supply and demand, is what I call empiricism taken to the stage of mental illness." Well said.
Right.
Empiricism sounds great. Hey, we're the culture of science. We experiment, we look at the world, we look at data. Well, we do, but you need theory as well. And also,
Yes.
a key point on this is that the methodology of the social sciences may differ from the methodology of the physical sciences. But I'm
Right.
not a physical scientist, so I can't speak to that. I can just say that the methodology that people imagine for the physical sciences doesn't work out well for economics. It doesn't work out well at all.
Even the hard scientists will eventually find themselves back to mathematics, and that's an axiomatic discipline.
That's true.
So
That's
not
true. Yeah.
not too dissimilar to what we're working with if you go back far enough.
Dave Bertrand says, let's give that 1895 tested academic agent and see if he is a 10. That's a fun idea. We'll have to suggest that to him. Okay, I think we're done. Next week is good for you, Ryan, right? To go into
Yes,
monarchy.
it is.
Right, okay, so we're going to
Yes.
continue with what we were doing last week, Eric von Knott-Ladine's Liberty or Equality. And we're going to talk about monarchy. I need to read the chapter soon to decide if we're going to pull in a little bit more, because it's just one chapter on, having critique democracy. He says we need to compare it to another system to not be unfair, right?
Right.
Maybe it's a terrible system,
Right.
but all the others are terrible too. So let's compare it to monarchy. So it's really about democracy compared to monarchy. So that'll be our topic next week. And it's just the one chapter, so we might want to pull in some Hoppe, who also wrote on this topic and has his own angle on it. Though I think it's pretty close to what Knott-Ladine says. But anyway, whatever the case, we're going to cover monarchy next week. I think you'll find it interesting, and you'll see that the economic way of thinking, that's how Hoppe comes at it. The economic way of thinking even helps us have insight on political systems. It helps us understand, as Mises's great book is titled, human action. And political action is part of
Right.
human action. So it gives us insight on that. Okay, so that's next week. Please subscribe, hit the bell, and we will see you next time. Bye.